Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the final session of today's Development Day. My name is Nick Everett. I'm the New Zealand Business Manager for the Institute of Managers and Leaders. I'm beaming into you from a very soggy Auckland, so no changes there from the last 6 months. I ngā tangata whenua, tēnā koutou. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today and paying respect to the elders, past, present and emerging. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa. A couple of notes before we get started. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. There will be an opportunity at the end to post questions in the Q&A section. And do please feel free to post comments in the chat box throughout the session. We'll attempt to answer as many of the questions at the end as we can. So the topic of this session, how we communicate within an organisation has a significant impact on the engagement, culture, and the overall effectiveness of people and teams. With remote and hybrid working now being the norm, the how, when, why, and what we communicate and to who can sometimes be pretty confusing. Add to that 5 generations in the workplace and advances in technology, and many aspects of workplace communication have become significantly more challenging. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Scott Martin. Scott is the General Manager for Membership and Product Development with the Institute of Managers and Leaders. He's a proud career manager and leader, having spent the past 15 years working with many of Australia and New Zealand's largest companies, developing and delivering impactful management and leadership programs. Scott has seen the impact of workplace changes firsthand. More recently, Scott has been focused on developing a broader and more sophisticated virtual offering, adjusting materials and formats, along with growing facilitator competency with a view to deliver the highest quality of blended learning. Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and it's my absolute pleasure to be with you this afternoon for a short period of time that I hope you'll find beneficial. As Nick said, my name is Scott Martin and I am the General Manager of, among other things, product development within the Institute of Managers and Leaders. This topic area, this subject area is something that's been on my mind and on my heart for that matter, probably for the last year to 2 years, as we've seen changes within the workplace occurring. And it's part of a much bigger piece of work that we're looking at in terms of our courseware and what we're doing and how we're doing it. So hopefully today I've distilled that down to about 50 minutes of content with particularly 2 key points that I want to try and get across that do come together in some shape or form. Can I just reiterate Nick's comments and thoughts and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I always love when Nick hosts things because he brings a real traditional Kiwi essence to that, which I think is fantastic as an organisation that works across both Australia and New Zealand. For the Institute, this idea of better managers and leaders for a better society is at the heart of what we do and how we do it. And I think for me, communication skills is at the very epicenter of that. I don't think too many people would argue with me when I say that generally great managers and great leaders are great communicators. And I don't mean by that getting up on stage in front of 1,000 people and getting people on their feet and rah-rah. What I'm talking about is in the trenches, day to day, week to week, month to month, people who can delegate, can engage people in a conversation and people who can take people on a journey and instill a vision in people, I think is at the very core of what we do as a business. And we spend a lot of time in our programs, working on those competencies, the various competencies that fit within communication skills more broadly. This quote is one of my favourite within this area and probably even more broadly within leadership and management. So this gentleman, George Bernard Shaw, lived from the late 1800s to about 1950, and he was an Irish playwright, quite a famous Irish playwright. So he would have made this statement somewhere around the early 1900s, that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And for me, in 2023, that is as relevant, if not more relevant, this idea that we've sent a message, we've communicated with someone, but has that been received? Has it been delivered? And more importantly, has it been understood? I might deviate momentarily just for a funny story, or at least it's a story that I think was funny. And I just happened to be in New Zealand recently, actually with Nick at a leadership conference, and I was speaking on the topic of mentally healthy workplaces. And to do that presentation, I get up and I introduce myself, and I generally basically say, I'm not here as a medical practitioner, I'm not here as a registered psychologist, I'm here as a manager and leader of almost 40 years, and that is the lens that I take on this subject matter. I then went on to deliver my presentation, which was about 30 minutes, finished off, answered some questions, and didn't think more of it until I was in the buffet line at lunchtime, and a gentleman walked up to me and said, so mate, are you still practicing as a GP and as a, or are you not practicing anymore as a GP and as a organizational psychologist? And I looked at him for about 30 seconds and the cogs in my brain started to tick over, and I thought to myself, he thinks that I was saying that whilst I'm a GP and an org psych, that I'm not there presenting as one. And what ensued was a very awkward conversation as I kind of retreated from that and said, no, I'm not that, I'm actually this. And as it turns out, a number of people within the audience actually thought the same thing. So what I thought was a great introduction, what I thought was impactful and quite descriptive of who I was actually quite misleading. And I think that goes on in workplaces everywhere, every day, and I think it's causing some great issues. If we look over the history of workplace communications, probably over the last 100, 150 years, we've seen a lot of change, and a lot of change more recently. The big things for me, I think, are things like invention of the telephone exchange, and then this era of paper up until about the 1970s, where distributing paper and messages on paper was all what it was about. And for anyone who was in my era, which is, I'll tell you, is over 50, those interdepartmental envelopes, bring almost a glint of nostalgia to my eye, that these things that used to be passed around and sit in trays and had lots of different names and squiggles and pen marks, they're actually an art form, and often they'd sit in people's trays, sometimes for 2 weeks, without moving on. So it wasn't the most efficient or effective way to distribute things. We then had, in the 80s and 90s, we had email come about, and I think email made a big change to that idea of moving paper around. We then had the iPhone. 2007 was the first iPhone, and I don't know if you saw on the news, but recently, out of the box iPhone, the first iPhone sold for about $240,000, which was quite crazy. And then more recently, we've had all these apps that have come about in terms of Slack and Teams and WhatsApp and different apps that help us to certainly communicate more efficiently, but does it help us to communicate more effectively? I guess my question for this audience at this juncture is what do you think has been the greatest innovation or impact on workplace communication over the last 50 years or within your lifetime? And what kind of changes to communication do you think have made the greatest impact? If you pop them into the chat, that would be really helpful. For me, I think we're getting email, mobile phones, same internet, Microsoft Teams, electronic comms. Excellent, excellent, excellent. I think this is very generational, obviously, and for me it's email, but I think for someone who is of a younger era, we might see that it's something like Teams. There's someone there, the Olivetti M24 for someone, that's probably going back a way bit in terms of, I think, a typewriter. So thank you for your contributions, that's fantastic. I think the thing for me is that this innovation is getting greater and it's getting almost quicker, and the changes to the proliferation of channels on which we can communicate is changing daily and weekly and monthly. Just to give you an idea of the size of this problem, I always think it's great to start with the problem. This is a significant problem in workplaces. This number, which is 1.2 trillion, big number, goes over everyone's head, but let me put that in perspective for you. So this was out of a Grammarly and Harris poll, a report you can Google, State of the Business Communication Report 2023, so it's fairly recent data. And that's what it suggests is the cost to the US economy and workplaces in a single year of poor communication. What that equates to is around $12,500 per employee per year. And that's significant. If you've got an organization of 20 people that would be about $250,000. If you've got an organisation of 100 people, we're talking 1 million, 1.2 million, that is impacting your business, that is coming off your bottom line effectively. For something like a public sector, say in Queensland, which is almost 240,000 people, we're talking $3 billion in the cost from poor communication. So it's significant, and I think it's impacting whether you've got 20 or 240,000 people. It's impacting us in significant ways. To kind of give you an idea what that looks like in practice, and where the rubber hits the road with this is the significant consequences of poor work communication. So this was from an Economist Intelligent Unit survey from 2018. So the data's a little bit older, but it's still very relevant. The highlight for me here is this idea, this 52% of respondents suggested that the impact of poor work communication is added stress. Now, I don't know if you're like me, you would understand that the workplace today does not need more stress. If anything, it needs a lot less stress. So this idea that this poor communication is adding to that mix of workplace stress at the moment, I think is a lot of red flags. Stress, you may be aware, plays out in a number of different ways, but definitely the cost to a business is through absenteeism, so people being away from work due to those issues, or people, what we call presenteeism, which is an incredibly huge growing problem where people are at work, but they're working less effectively than they could be or should be. The other things on that list, delay or failure to complete a project, low morale, missed performance goals, obstacles to innovation, failure to close a sale. I'm sure you all resonate with them. And to me, they're much more attributable and closely related to either a reduction in revenue, increase in cost, or a decrease in productivity within a workplace. So hopefully I've kind of made the point that this is a big issue. And for me, my observation is it's getting more problematic by the week at the moment. When I think of a problem, I come back to basics. I think if I want to solve a problem, I come back to basics. And for me, the communication model is just that. It's very basic. It's a very simple model. And many of you would have come across the communication model, and some of you would probably be rolling your eyes back saying, hopefully he's not going to go and spend the rest of this session talking about the communication model. I like to think back to simplicity. And if we've got a problem, somewhere in this communication model is where the problem's happening. Very simply, it's a sender. I've got a message to send. I think of what that message looks like, so I encode it into a message. I then send it to someone. They decipher the message or decode the message in their own words using their brain. At the same time, around the outside is this idea of feedback. Feedback is an integral part of communication to make sure that a message is understood, but something that's not happening very well or happening very often. That idea of getting feedback, making sure you're on the same page and moving forward with that. This idea of noise sitting around the outside is both physical noise, so literally could be someone banging on a hammer in the background as you either send that message or receive that message, or it could be your state of mind. All sorts of things can create noise within that communication model. Again, very simple, but if it's so simple, why do we so often get it wrong? And I think that's the question that we, this development day, and as we move forward, we've got to think about, okay, there's the problem. Why do we get it so wrong? And for me, why we get it wrong is often the fact that people are involved. And I often give Michael Scott, and for many of you, I'm sure would have watched The Office, the American version of The Office. So Michael Scott was the manager of Dunder Mifflin. And I think Michael Scott, for all intentional purposes, was a great paper salesperson who got promoted into a management leadership role and perhaps didn't quite nail that. And the whole show is built around his inability to manage and lead, and for the most part, communicate. This idea that his quote that I love, this, sometimes I'll start a sentence and I don't even know where it's going. I just hope I find it along the way. And I know that I think we've all worked with people that would fit into that box, and we ourselves can often fit into that box when we're put on the spot and we start talking without actually thinking. That idea of engaging your brain before you speak is a really important one, and Michael Scott too often doesn't do it. moving forward in this presentation, I just wanted to make, I really wanted to focus in on two critical considerations for you, and two things I want you to think about when you go back to your workplaces. One is this idea of understanding your audience better. And that is in the model, if we relate back to the model, this idea of the receiver. How do I understand my audience before I communicate? The second part that we'll go into is this idea to reconsider your workflows. Think about how you're working, why you're working like that, because it impacts incredibly the way you communicate. And hopefully I'll work through those two considerations. So firstly, this idea of the receiver. And I love this quote from Joseph Batten. Now, Joseph Batten was actually, for all intentional purposes, was a sound engineer, and he was instrumental in developing the gramophone. So I think the context of what he was saying was probably different. But for me, it works beautifully for this idea of communication, in that the idea that it's the responsibility of the sender to make sure the receiver understands the message. And please, again, I'd like for that to be something you take away from this, is it's actually your job to make sure the receiver understands the message, not vice versa. If I go back to that same survey that I alluded to before, the Economist Intelligence Unit survey of 2018, these are listed, the responses to what is the poor, in your workplace, what is the cause of poor communication? The one I want to focus on initially is this idea of different communication styles. So the irony for me is that in all the things that have changed in the world, and all the technology changes, the way we communicate, how we communicate, this idea that the number one issue that we have, and perhaps it's not a surprise to people in the audience, but it was a reminder for me that this idea of having different communication styles, again, that we have people involved in the communication process, is the number one by a fair margin in terms of why communication breaks down. Some of the other things, unclear responsibilities, time pressures, lack of leadership, personal differences, client demands, they're all really important. But unfortunately, with the limitation of time today, I'm just going to focus initially on this idea of different communication styles. So we use in our programs, I thought I'd give you an example that is very real to us as a business and very real to us and how we operate. We use DISC in a lot of our programs, particularly our foundational new manager, new leader programs. For those who have come across it, again, some people love DISC, some people prefer other tools. There are lots of tools on the market that look at behavioural styles and thus communication styles. I really love DISC because of its simplicity. It's easy to explain, it's easy to understand, and it works. More than anything, it works. Quite simply, in the brevity of time today, the model works. You do about 80 survey questionnaire, and that's the results of that survey would land you as a dot on this DISC chart. If you land in the different quadrants, that would dictate a different behavioural style and thus different communication style. For us as an organisation, we got the sales team together earlier in the year, and at the same time, we chose to do the whole business. We did put everything through DISC so that we could do what's called a cultural map and show what that looked like on a DISC chart. So there in front of you, you have 33 dots representing, at the time, about 80% of the people that were working in our organisation, and shows you the different behavioural styles across the business. The observation of that initially is that it's pretty good. It's pretty broad. We've got a good cross-section of different behavioural styles, different communication styles, which is fantastic. When we looked into that for the sales team, specifically, we did an activity and exercise where we said, right, let's look at the sales team where they sit. For the most part, the sales team, and this mightn't be a surprise to anyone who's worked in sales or dealt with sales, that many of our salespeople fell into the D, I, and S category. So driven, results-driven, enthusiasm, things like support, they're all things that generally would describe the sales department of a normal business and a normal organisation. We had some people in the C category, so it's not so much that if you're in a certain area, you can't sell or you're not a great salesperson. I don't want to give you that inference. In our situation, though, we had the predominance of people sitting in D, I, and S. And that's great to know, great knowledge. The thing is, though, and the clanger for me is that the people that support the sales team, all the people who sit around it and make sure that once we sell a program, that the delivery of that program goes beautifully, that we invoice correctly, All the sales support, the IT people, all those people within our business sat within the C quadrant. And that creates this difference in communication style. So ultimately, if the sales team want to be successful, if they want to have repeat business with clients, if they want to do well, they've got to work out pretty quickly how they communicate with the C style versus their own style. Hopefully that makes sense. I just thought I'd put on the chart, me, I've put there, I'm on S, a little bit below from an introvert extrovert point of view, but I'm on that support style, which is very much my personality and my behavioral style. What does that mean in practice? And I thought I'd just share this with you. And in your resources that I'm sending out, there's a very quick Ready Reckoner to help you. If you haven't done this before, there's a little Ready Reckoner, a one-pager that lets you put yourself within one of those categories. It also helps you perhaps to get your team to do it so you can kind of see where you sit in terms of the rest of your team. I've also added a sheet there which allows you to see how you flex your behavioral style into these other styles. I just wanted to kind of stress for those how you flex your behavioral style to this C style. So for me, and again, I'm putting myself, I'm almost the opposite style to this, is get to the business quickly, be prepared, systematic, factual, logical, be clear and precise in all communication, be fairly matter of fact and avoid becoming emotive, be logical. These are the kind of things, if you're communicating to C styles, if you're having relationships, if you're working with those people in your organization, flexing and adapting your communication style to that is going to make your the way you interact and the way you communicate far more effective. Provide evidence and negotiate timelines. Don't exaggerate the advantage of your proposal. For me, it's about both parts flexing. Who flexes and how much dictates how effective your communication is. If people want to say, that's how I am, that's who I am, that's how I communicate, then you're probably going to get what you put into the whole thing. But if you're able to flex your communication style, and if both parties are able to flex, you're going to get a lot better outcomes in terms of communication. Now, I've done that fairly quickly, and I apologise again for brevity, but I hope you've understood the outcome of that is, try and work out through either the complementary things on the internet or through using something like this, work out what your behavioural style and your communication style is, what the people around you, and flex your style. Try and adapt your style in terms of how that looks. The second part of this equation that I wanted to put into play is this idea of 5 generations in the workplace. So on this chart in front of you is actually 4 of the 5 generations. I've just included over to the right, the 5th, which is traditionalist, or what we call the silent generation, born approximately from 1928 to 1945, sitting at the very top of the tree. Now, there's not too many of those people left in the workplace. The predominant is baby boomers, Generation X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. And then at the bottom, we've got the alpha generation born from 2010 onwards who are coming in behind. So ultimately, I think this idea of having 5 generations in the workplace is going to be with us with some time to come. Now, this chart is somewhat of an overgeneralization. So on one hand, I apologize for that, but I also don't. I think sometimes overgeneralizations help us to understand this at the very ends of the spectrum. What this diagram is alluding to is that different generations gravitate towards different communication styles, but also different communication channels. So baby boomers, the inference is loves verbal, personal interaction, so would love phone calls, meeting face-to-face, talking things out one-on-one. Generation X, the inference is email and text. Again, using email is their preference, and Generation Y, millennials, text, social media. Generation Z, instant messaging, face-to-face meetings, almost coming full circle again in terms of how people like to interact. I think, again, for me, it's about understanding the different communication styles that are happening within the workplace. Who are you communicating with? What generation are they possibly from? Now, again, it's an overgeneralization. You might find that someone who's 55 loves using Snapchat. I don't know so much, but that's, I don't think you should assume anything. I think the equation here is to talk to people and work out how they like to communicate and the best ways to communicate so that your communication could be more effective. I know in today's first session, email came up a fair bit, and I think this article, which happened in about 2015, it's quite legendary on the internet. This guy, John Brandon, basically foretold the end of email. And obviously that's been quite wrong, to the point where email is actually continuing to grow in the number of emails we sent. And as we saw on that last slide, there are certain generations that gravitate towards email almost as a safe place. It may not be the most effective way to communicate, but we're still communicating with email. And I think this is one of, as I'll go into a little bit later in this presentation, how we're using these different tools and why we're using them, we have to kind of look at more closely. The problem with email is obviously it's morphing in how we're using email versus Teams versus Slack versus chat. It's almost blurring into one, which is causing some chaos within organizations. Emails are actually, as I said, growing in popularity, but we know there's a lot of spam, there's a lot of clutter going on within emails, and it's becoming much harder to use in the way we used to probably use it 10 years ago or 20 years ago when it first came about. Before I move on, I just wanted to touch on two other considerations when you're thinking about audience, the audience that you're delivering a message to. The first one is this idea of neurodiversity. Now, the data would suggest that somewhere between 15 to 20% of the population is neurodiverse. Now, neurodiversity is a broad church of conditions that has almost grown, that diversity has grown over time in terms of what it covers. And I have a personal thing here with one of my daughters having dyslexia. And what I've found, and I guess I don't want to go into this, I don't have the time to go into this too deep, it's probably another webinar on its own, but my observation is that in workplaces, so my daughter has dyslexia, and school has been very, very good at making accommodations for that within testing and within school. They have their head across this and they're working with these different conditions. My observation is that workplaces, not so much. And there's a lot of people going into workplaces who, where they don't feel safe declaring or identifying as dyslexic or autistic or whatever it might be in terms of this, this area of neurodiversity, if organisations are not a safe place to identify, then it's very hard if you've got to accommodate different messaging and different channels of communication that they're not necessarily being effective. I think bottom line is organisations need to create this safer place so people can clearly and happily identify, but then we've got to not necessarily look at communication as one-dimensional. The other bit of data that I think is really fascinating is this idea that this chart on the right-hand side is up to 2021. So as we sit here in 2023, potential is that something like a quarter of people of the population, something like a quarter of the population have speak a non-English at home. And again, I think that within the workplace and how we communicate within the workplace, it's really important. If we're just communicating in one dimension or even one language, sometimes if your workplace has a lot of people where English is second language, it may be that your communication, all staff communications may have to be in different languages. Just something to consider moving forward. I thought this was a wonderful article from our friends at Slack, and Slack obviously have a vested interest in a particular way of communication, but this article was very broad in its pickup in terms of the ability to pick the most appropriate channel for your message. And I thought these 3 steps really resonated with me. So number 1 is consider the type of message you're sending. Is that message formal, informal? Does it need to be referenced? Is it urgent or time sensitive? Is it confidential? Things like that might depend on which channel you choose to send that message. Is it walking over and having a chat to someone if they're in the office? Think about how the best channel to send that message, depending on the type of message and the style of message. Step number 2, I think, is probably the crux of things for me. Reflect on your workplace values around messaging and delivery methods. After going through all this, I really feel that organisations and workplaces need to take a step back and look at how they're communicating. If you don't have a communication plan, if you don't have values, if you don't have processes around how you're communicating and the different ways you're communicating, given the different audiences, I think it's about time people stopped and took a good look at that and made sure that people understood this is how we communicate within Company X or within our organisation. Step number 3, choose a communication channel that will best reach your audience. So having thought through that, having looked at your organisational values and how we communicate, if there is a plan in place, choose a communication channel that will best reach your audience. And sometimes if you sit back and take a moment to think about it, it might be that you don't send an all-staff email, or you might find a different way or a better way to make that communication more effective, given the complexity of your audience within your organisation. I want to change tack here a little bit and go a little bit broader, I want to go up a gear potentially. And this idea of the new world of work and the question mark, is it helping? Is it helping our communication, or is it making it harder? And for me, there's no doubt that there's a lot of elements that are being made harder because of where we found ourselves post-COVID. So this idea of this perception that work from home, and this idea that we're sitting out doing yoga, having really healthy lunches, working within time limits. For some people, there's no doubt that work from home has been fantastic, and work from home is here to stay, and this hybrid model is here to stay. But certainly for some people, and probably myself included, the reality is that it's not all beer and Skittles, and it's not all just lining up like the left-hand picture. This idea of working outside hours, being always on. One of the things I'd like to ask you at this juncture is, with respect to the number of meetings, in the last couple of years, the number of meetings that you're attending, both in terms of the quantity of those meetings and the times taken, I'd like you to kind of have a stab in the chat about the increase. Is that increasing? So increase, and the percentage that you think roughly what the percentage is in terms of increase or decreasing, for that matter. I shouldn't lead the witness, but just pop in the chat the time you've spent and the number of meetings you're having. Are they increasing or decreasing, and the amount that it's increasing? So we've got increase 400%, no change for me. Increase 50%, increase 25%, increasing about 50%, 100%. No change, fantastic. About the same. Decrease from last year, fantastic. Okay, I think my rough straw poll is that it's increasing at a reasonable number. So thank you so much for putting those into the chat. And there's no doubt, if your meetings have not changed or decreased, your organisation is doing something spectacularly well, or your situation has changed, because I can tell you this is 2022 Microsoft Work Trend Index reported that the average team user saw a 252% increase in their weekly meeting times and 153% increase in the number of weekly meetings they have. And across the 365 app, the people were spending about 50% of their time communicating in meetings, emails, and chats. And that's a significant amount. And my question and my thought-provoking thing for you today is, what's that doing to this idea of flow and getting work done? And more specifically, what's that doing in terms of the brain? And it's some interesting, if you care to, after this, if you Google Microsoft meetings and the impact of the brain, you'll see that Microsoft have done quite a bit of work. It's not a huge study, and I think they're going to do more work on this, but the impact of the brain of back-to-back meetings through a day is quite substantial and quite significant, to the point where I think at some point, if we continue this idea of having 4 or 5 or 6 back-to-back meetings in a day, that there'll be a Surgeon General's warning on that you shouldn't drive home after that, because your ability cognitively to operate a vehicle is probably greatly impaired after doing 6 or 7 back-to-back meetings where you've got heavy stuff going on. It's real, and it's here at the moment. I also wanted to bring up this idea of digital presenteeism, because again, it's sort of post-COVID, where we find ourselves is this idea of this always on workplace, and this idea that digital presenteeism is creating a future of work that nobody wants. So while on one hand, excuse me, work from home can create this wonderful environment where we're not commuting. We're potentially getting more done. But if you're being sucked into this way of working that we're kind of finding ourselves in post-COVID, it makes it very difficult to get stuff done. And if you're working at all times of the night, if you're always on, it has impacts to us from a mentally healthy workplace. I want to finish by talking about this idea of synchronous versus asynchronous. Now, many of you may have come across these terms in terms of workflows, and ultimately, from my point in this last bit of the presentation, I'm talking about workflows and communication. They go hand in hand. They I'm going to use them as one. But the idea of synchronous workflows or synchronous communication is where it's happening live. So this webinar, for instance, is a synchronous occurrence. It's a synchronous sort of thing. If you come back tomorrow or the next day and watch the recording of this webinar, that is asynchronous. So just to give you another couple of examples so that I'm very clear on this, synchronous, if I ring up someone and have a chat with them today, that is a synchronous activity. If I email traditionally was asynchronous. So the way we used to use email was basically we sent off a message and we didn't necessarily expect that message to be answered straight away, or sometimes not even answered at all. And I guess it's my great observation, and this is kind of where I'm leading with this, is where we find ourselves in 2023, post-COVID, is we've tried to relate what we used to do pre-COVID and the way we used to work in the office. We've tried to bring that to 2023, and that is very highly synchronous in the way we operate. And a lot of that is around, we've got to have meetings. We've got to have more meetings. This got to be dealt with in the meetings. Many of you would have seen, that meeting sure could have been an email, is a quote that I hear a lot. And this idea of back-to-back, I'm back-to-back on Tuesday, sorry, I can't fit you in. I think back-to-back, if anything, might be the term for 2022 and 2023 in terms of the meetings that we're having. On the left side of that tug of war are three very popular apps: Slack, Teams, and Zoom. On the right side of that tug of war are three not so well-known, certainly from my perspective, three not so well-known apps: Yak, Spike, and Twist. Now, it just so happens that those three apps are very much set about, their whole world is about asynchronous communication and dealing with work in an asynchronous manner. Slack, Teams, and Zoom were set up, and the way we're using them is very much as a synchronous thing. We're sending a Slack message and we're expecting a response straight away. It's interesting, though, that the applications themselves are not asynchronous or synchronous. It's actually the way we're using them and the expectation that sits within the workplace on whether these things are synchronous or asynchronous. And my point is that we've got to start thinking of the way we're working in a more asynchronous manner. We've got to take that shift back and we've got to look, did we need to have that meeting? Could that be done in an asynchronous manner by recording some information, sending it out to our colleagues, getting feedback, and then giving them a deadline and getting that information dealt with by a specific time. So I think that is definitely getting that balance right is one of the big impacts that we're seeing in 2023. I hope I've explained that well. I probably fell over myself a little bit. I think it's a good way to do is look at the benefits of asynchronous workflows or communication. Because I think if you see the benefits, then you'll understand that we've got to kind of start looking at what we're doing and how we're doing it. Because to me, it impacts incredibly how we're communicating as an organisation. So communication flow improves regardless of time zones or working hours. Whether you, so Nick lives in New Zealand, Nick has effectively 2 hours time difference with most of the people he works with. It's very easy for his workday to go from being 8 hours to 10 hours on the basis that, you know, he's always on, he's looking at his emails in those 2 hours that overlap. But asynchronous, when we work asynchronous, there's not this pressure on to be looking at our emails and looking at our messages. Allows for, and I think this really comes back to what we were talking about previously, allows for different types of personalities to thrive in the workplace and encourages longer periods of deep concentrated work. that ability to kind of lock ourselves in a room, get some stuff done for 3 hours, not be interrupted by meetings, by emails, by Teams, by Slack messages. That is the key to what we need to change within the workplace. In particular, this idea of waste and cost reduction. So I think the figure is about $37 billion that is wasted in the US economy in terms of meetings that don't need to happen. As a simple example, if 4 of you are in a meeting and at $70 an hour, that's $280 that's sitting there being eaten up. Perhaps if 3 of those people or 2 of those people don't talk at all or don't need to be there, either the meeting itself or the invitee have got to be looked at and changed. By reducing our meetings, you're not only improving productivity, but also reducing costs. It also helps us to manage stakeholders easily. The model gives you flexibility to collaborate, and definitely it gives you better outputs. There's no doubt if you've got time to think about something and time to feed into something, that's really important. That gives us better quality of outputs. I should say that these last few slides come from an organisation called Nova, and I've put the link there, novatools.org. And Nova is just another one of the organisations that is working very hard to provide tools for organisations. And I have no vested interest in them, but I thought the information they provided was incredible in terms of helping people to move to asynchronous workflows and communication. Okay, some tips for thinking about how do we move. How do I move? How do my team move? Or how do our organisation move to this more asynchronous model of working? And I should say it's not about one or the other. For me, it's about getting the balance right, about looking how you're working now and how we can better work if we get that balance right, if we stop wanting people to communicate in a synchronous manner. Number one, reflect on how many meetings you have each week where only one person speaks and a few people participate or actively listen. Can you use other tools or channels to distribute this information in an asynchronous manner? That means stopping, perhaps after a meeting, do a bit of a debrief and say, did we need to have this meeting? How could we have done this differently within an asynchronous manner? Evaluate how many meetings you have each week to share new proposals, designs. So where you're sharing information, where one person is for the most part talking. Try turning one of these meetings into asynchronous, using the different tools that are in the marketplace. Slack itself has created, seeing this, has created some recording tools that let you very quickly, and Zoom's the same. All these apps let you record your meetings and let you record so that they are creating asynchronous ways of doing things. The first goal is to reduce the number of synchronous meetings by half in a month. Now, if you could do that, imagine the difference it would come to in terms of people's time and the cost of the business. Just coming back to email and what I alluded to is this idea of stop having conversations in emails. What it does is potentially silos information that probably could be shared with a broader audience. This idea that we're sort of morphing email into almost a chat function, I think is part of the challenge. Stop having conversations in email. You've got to start thinking as an organisation what tools you're using, when you're using them and how you're using them, and try and put some guidelines for people around what that looks like, how we communicate within Company X. It will help information more accessible to everyone who needs it and provide a collaborative space for everyone to work together. Importantly, have that specific medium like Teams or like Slack. That's what we use for more urgent things. If I want to get a response from someone, the problem we've got is if people are using text, if they're using WhatsApp, if they're using Snapchat, for instance, it gets very confusing within the workplace. And again, I come back to this idea of 5 generations that it can get quite confusing as to how we're communicating and why we're communicating. Very, very importantly is get support from your leadership team. It has to come from the top down. You can make changes within what you do, and that's going to definitely, I think, make your life better, and it's going to impact you. You can make changes within the team that you lead or the team that you operate within. But if the organisation can go together and work together to try and get this balance better, then I think the implications and the ripple effect across the organisation are significant. And lastly, importantly, I think this idea of having a communication plan, I'd implore you to take a step back, sit back and work out how we're communicating, why we're communicating, try and get this idea of that again, linking this back to mentally healthy workplaces, we've got to stop communicating all hours of the clock. We've got to stop. It is proving to be very, very unhealthy at the moment, the way we're working. And a lot of it comes back to this almost fear of missing out in terms of communication and things popping up at all times of night and feeling you've got to deal with them. I think organisations have got to embrace this and take it on and from a planning point of view to say, this is how we communicate. This is what we do in this organisation. In summary and closing, and I hope I brought this together. On one hand, nothing has changed. Communication is still about the communication model. Always come back to that. If you're having a problem with communication, be it one-on-one, be it your team, bring it back to that model, dissect the model and say, am I getting this wrong? Am I using the wrong channels? Is the noise, are people not in the right headspace? Think about that communication model in terms of how you're communicating. I would say though, the changing nature of our audience, 5 generations in the workplace, neurodiversity, English as a second language, different communication styles, the difference in technology and the proliferation of channels that we've got to choose from, along with this incredibly quick shift to hybrid. And my observation is a lot of organisations are doing hybrid very clunkily. So you've got that in the mix too, that is it 3 days in, 2 days out? What are those 3 days? What are those 2 days? You put that layer into this and it causes quite a bit of chaos. We need to step back and we need to reflect on that. Importantly, if we continue to communicate one-dimensionally, and what I mean by that is treating everyone the same. If we're sending out one message on one channel in one manner, we're going to end up with poor outcomes. If we're not adapting what we do and how we do it, both organisationally within our team and ourselves individually, we're going to end up with poor outcomes. We've got to adapt our styles. We've got to adapt our messaging. We've got to adapt the channels to be most appropriate for what's going to do that. And again, to reiterate, I think the organisation needs to have plans and structure around this. What I've seen is this rapid move to a very clunky hybrid space has left a lot of organisations reeling in terms of the way they're communicating, and I think that needs to change. I think that is the information that I have for you today. I'll put back over to you, Nick, just to answer any of the questions that might have popped up, and hopefully I haven't confused people completely.
Thanks, Scott. Fantastic presentation, great insights, and definitely, there's a few questions here. Something that I think stood out to me throughout was do something, because from what I've seen and the people that I've been speaking with recently, there is a lot of frustration in this space. But I don't think that there's been enough trying a new approach. And as always, pick an approach, obviously discuss it with your organization, your leadership team, give it a go, test it out, review it after a certain point and try it again or try something different. But yeah, it's quite obvious with this new way of working and all these channels, if we continue to sit here and try and muddle our way through like we're doing at the moment, we're just going to keep getting these poor outcomes. So obviously, yeah, leaders, lead from the front, role model it, pick something up and give it a go. But a couple of questions here. I think there was definitely a theme of that tension, and especially if anyone was on the first session, the tension between making sure that we're creating a sense of belonging with our staff, that we are having those kind of face-to-face opportunities versus too many meetings back to back. You might have already answered this, I think, in that slide where you spoke about picking the right channel and also making sure that you are taking the time to have those face-to-face ones while still using the technology and the different things that are available to us, instead of everyone sitting in a one-to-many meeting that could be done via a different channel. But definitely the theme coming through the questions was that tension, the balance between the face-to-face engagement versus overload and too many meetings.
Yeah, I think I should probably stress that this ain't easy, and I'm for the most part, my kids call me a boomer, and I think I am a boomer, and so I come from a certain era, and I don't love certain things that are going on at the moment, but you're trying to kind of work it in the whole mix of how things are working, but it's certainly not easy. And I think what I would say is every organisation is different, and even within organisations, the IT department might be different to the sales department. So it's fine to have sort of one overarching thing, but even as a team, I think you kind of need to within the tools that are available in your workplace, and now whether those tools are the best or effective, or there's a lot of tools coming out. Like honestly, every day there's a new tool to help us communicate, and you've got to pick. You've got to land somewhere. But within the tools that are available in your organisation, it's about saying, even within our team, this is how we communicate. If you please don't be sending messages, after a certain period of time, and I would ask that people don't. So I think putting those parameters around and using the right things and how you use them, it's not easy, but gee, the outcome you've seen the cost, you've seen the mental wellness in the workplace is at risk. We need to get it right. So yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, there was one question I liked here asking you to clarify what we should be using email for. Is the ideal to use email for external communication only?
I think great question. I see it as again, I see it as if we go back to using email as an asynchronous tool. So if I want to send a document out to a group of people, the message is not too emotive, then I will use, and again, I'm of an era that grew up with email. Email is it's part of my life. I'm certainly not on Snapchat. I've got used to Teams and Slack and communicating that way, but I get very confused. Should I send that message out on Teams or should I send it out on email? And again, I think I can give you, and certainly the internet can give you some thoughts on what works best, but you've kind of got to work that out, that, these things are what we do on email, these things are what we do on Slack. And in that presentation, I tried to kind of, if it's urgent and you want a response during work hours and the person's there and you can kind of get a really cool, Slack and Teams are fantastic when they're used correctly. Email is fantastic when it's used correctly, but when they're not used correctly, you get very confused about, what you should be doing where. But for me, email is about broader communication, perhaps with a document, not necessarily wanting a response, but sharing information and specific information. I still love, face-to-face one-on-ones is fantastic. I think that the screen versus being in an office, I think being on a screen all day, we know it's exhausting. We know that there's stuff going on with our brains. So it's not like if you have 3 or 4 face-to-faces versus 3 or 4 virtual meetings. There's different things going on in the brain, and everything I've spoken about today ultimately comes back to the brain, how we're wired and how our brains change. Is what this is all about. Our brains cannot deal with massive amounts of change in short periods of time. And I would kind of put what's going on in the world in that box in some respects.
Good comment there as well from Donna. Email is proof and reference, which I think, just aligns with what you were saying there. A question from Philip. I think Philip's noting, is there a matrix emerging? What are we communicating? Who needs to know? What's the best channel to communicate? Is there a bit of a matrix?
I think that's exactly what it is. And whether that's hard and fast in organisations, I think we can get where we need to go. We just need to be more intentional about it. And I think I'm not in love with hard and fast rules saying, you can't send an SMS. Because again, if I know, if I want my father who's 87 really quickly, I don't send him an SMS because he may check his SMS, I don't know, never. So I know that I ring him and try and track him down. If I want my 15-year-old daughter really quickly, I download Snapchat or whatever it is, and I send her a message through that. Or it's horses for courses. But I think we can get there if we're more intentional about it and how. And I don't want to be overly prescriptive because I think that kind of it's different for different organisations, as I said. So, yeah.
Maybe finally, unless anyone does want to pop a final question into the box there, just returning to the point that you were making around the day getting longer because you're maybe communicating across different countries or time zones. A lot of that as well is going to come back to, again, I suppose the processes that the business puts in place and whether the leaders are being really clear about expectations when it comes to working hours, which we all know has gotten a lot looser post-COVID. But as well, it's going to come back to self-management, right? So when you spoke about, I suppose, my example of working New Zealand, Australia, at the moment, I've got 2 small kids, and 5 o'clock for me is cut-off time. Like, that's shutdown time. I'm needed elsewhere, and that's quite a strong piece of, I suppose, self-management at the moment. Maybe it's not self, maybe that's external factors. But I know, previous to the situation I'm in currently, absolutely, like working 2 hours past the 5 o'clock became the norm. Very easy to do. So once, I suppose, the business has made that decision and your leaders are role modeling, setting those expectations, again, it comes down to the individual to manage that and to be clocking off or doing whatever's needed to ensure that they're not working, well over what they should be doing.
I think it's one of the key points. We've only got yourself, Nick, in one country with only 2 hours time difference, and we see how problematic it is even with that. So if you're an organisation that has multiple countries and multiple time zones, there has to be a firmness, and with 2 young kids, and we have to be better as workplaces. And again, it's not easy. It's easy for me to get up here and say this, but we have to be better at workplaces at putting boundaries around this, and almost being, there needs to be penalties of sorts with this kind of behaviour being put up as the norm. Otherwise, it gets very difficult. But we've got to get that right, because it's quite complex when you add it into the whole mix of things if you've got multiple time zones. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, Scott. It looks like that's the majority of the questions. So I think we can wrap that up for today. I would like to thank everyone who has joined 1, 2, or 3 of the sessions across today. If they've sparked a fire for further learning, please do take a look at the other support that the Institute can provide, whether that be one of the leadership programs, short courses, or events that we run. There is still plenty happening throughout the rest of the year, and there's always the opportunity to join our growing community of members. Scott, any final words before we depart?
No, I just think, I thank everyone for being part of today. We love these days. They're great. We love to give back to the community, and we probably one thing we are going to put out there shortly is what is the next topic. We're going to do another development day in October, so maybe if you can think about that, even pop it in the chat now. What's a great topic that we could do in a few months' time for our next development day, because we're always looking for ideas and suggestions, and we want to be on current and on trend and talking about things that hopefully give you tips and tricks, but also get you start thinking and having chats with your teams and back in your organisation. So please, we will probably put something on social media, a poll about that, but please put them into the chat. But thank you so much for those who have been with us today. With, as Nick said, 1, 2, or 3 sessions, and I hope you've enjoyed Development Day.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Hey, Nick.